Shalom, I'm Moshe Margolin, one of the co-chairs, along with Freddie Perlmutter, of the Adult Education Committee of the Jewish Center in Princeton, New Jersey. On behalf of the committee, I welcome you to the third presentation in the Adult Education Goes Global series. The series was created to take advantage of virtual learning experiences which can originate live from anywhere in the world. This semester's presenters are from Hungary, England, Israel, the Netherlands, and the United States. Before I welcome Professor Ruderman, I would like to go over the ground rules for tonight. If you have questions for Professor Ruderman, please use the chat function to submit them for consideration. Please make every effort to keep them as concise as possible. Audience members will remain muted throughout the presentation. This is being done to avoid inadvertent distractions. This evening's speaker has been teaching for 5 decades. He recently retired from the University of Pennsylvania, where he served as the Joseph Meyerhoff Professor of Modern Jewish History and the director of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies. He is a prolific writer and truly a distinguished scholar, being a past president of the American Academy for Jewish Research and the recipient of the prestigious National Foundation for Jewish Culture's Lifetime Achievement Award. Professor Ruderman will examine the fascinating life and Jewish thought of Solomon Yom Tov Bennett, whose odyssey from Belarus to Copenhagen to Berlin and London makes him a global figure during the Enlightenment. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Ruderman to the Jewish Center. David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Moshe. And thank you, Frank, both of you for helping with all the preparation for this lecture. And I thank the Jewish Community Center for their kind invitation. As Moshe mentioned, I've been doing this kind of thing for 50 years, perhaps not on Zoom, but nevertheless, what's called in the trade synagogues. Those are gigs in synagogues. I accepted this kind of invitation, both because I knew this congregation was a very serious one, but also because I could stay home and do this on Zoom. And second of all, because I didn't want to give just another popular lecture. I wanted to talk about a work in progress. So I'm being both generous with my time to you, but also very selfish and in making you a captive audience for some of my ideas which are emerging for the first time. So here's how I want to do this. And I'm going to try to speak about 50, 55 minutes at the most. And I'm watching myself, so I will be precise and leave enough time for questions and your comments and criticisms. I want to talk very briefly about myself and my own work, not so much because I'm an egotist, but because I want to contextualize what I'm doing here. Just throwing you a topic makes no sense. And I want to show you how it relates to all my other work. And it's just another stepping stone, which goes on at the age of 77, which I am right now. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself and my previous work. And then I want to talk about the nature of what this work is all about. That's all as a kind of overview and introduction. Then I'm going to show you pictures, which is very new for me. I've been lecturing for years without PowerPoint, but there were so many interesting pictures here. And as you will see, my subject is also an engraver, so he left us a wide variety of things to look at, and therefore we need to look at them as well. And I'm going to show you a kind of lifeline of all of his activities and give you at least the bare bones of his life. And then I want to reflect on a piece that I just wrote recently, a very short piece, about why I think this particular life is significant and why I'm spending my time working on it in old age, or a late middle age, if it's not old age. Anyway, let me begin. So, who am I? I mean, besides Moshe's generous introduction, I'm a son of a rabbi who grew up in a rabbinic home. I also happen to have a rabbinic degree, a Reform rabbinical degree, although I chose from a very early age to go into academia. I grew up in a youth movement called Young Judea, and spent all of my time from the age of 14 on teaching other young people. And that relationship with Young Judea still remains after many, many years. I also have been blessed by wonderful teaching and learning experiences. My doctorate, in addition to my rabbinic degree, my doctorate is from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And therefore, my connection with the Center of Israeli Scholarship was an incredible, rich experience of my early life. I've also taught at 3 universities. Before I came to Penn 28 years ago, I was at the University of Maryland, which was my first job, and my second job was at Yale. And each time I created Jewish studies programs and became very richly involved with program building. I mentioned that there are 3 passions that I've been able to exploit in my teaching experience. One is doing scholarship and writing books, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The other is teaching, which I love and which I have done for many years, including a series of lectures which I did about 20, 25 years ago, but still seem to circulate for the teaching company, the great teachers courses. And the third is building programs, administering. What in the Jewish word schnoring is perhaps appropriate. Although I'm not schnoring tonight, I've spent a lot of time raising money for programs to build, including the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Pennsylvania. My work is that of an intellectual historian who began at the very young age to discover the Renaissance and European history and ask the very simple question, where were Jews in this picture? And at that time, when I was doing my undergraduate work in the 1960s, that question was not obvious. I spent my doctorate writing about a Jew in the Renaissance. I went on to write a second biography of a Jewish doctor who also was very involved in the magical arts and in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism. And then I eventually became fascinated with the topic of science and medicine and wrote several works dealing with the history of Jews and their relationship to the scientific revolution, to medicine, to science, to the larger culture. From Italy, which was my first love, I went to England and wrote 3 books. I physically went to England, but I also went intellectually to England, following the trail of Newton and Locke and the remarkable history of the English people and the place of Jews in this culture, writing a book about the Jews and the Enlightenment, several other books which I will not mention. Finally, a kind of overview of my period as I was training graduate students at the University of Penn called Early Modern Jewry, A New Cultural History. And most recently, a book about missionaries, converts, and rabbis in the 19th century. My interests fall into the area of Jewish-Christian relations, particularly those marginal figures that were on the borderlines between Judaism and Christianity, or looked at Judaism from the perspective of the larger majority culture and tried to create a meaningful liaison, a meaningful relationship between the worlds they lived in. Jewish-Christian relations have always interested me, not only to the extent that Christian culture influences Judaism both negatively and positively, but also how Jews have influenced their own environment as a very vital and significant minority within Christian civilization. this work is about a 19th century Jew, and it deals, like many of the others, with biography. For me, biography is a very special part of history. I have been involved, as you see, since my first book that I published in 1981. It is the study of an individual life and resurrecting that life, even if the figure seems to be a minor figure. I was especially attracted to people who are not well known, not Maimonides, not Spinoza, but you're going to hear tonight about a guy named Solomon Bennett, who no one has really heard of except for a few specialists. But indeed, I found the life a very exciting means of getting on the ground, in touching specific details, in seeing nuance, and able to explore the interstices between these two cultures and how they work and how they negotiate, how Jews negotiate a meaningful life between the Jewish and the non-Jewish world. Clearly, that role of mediation between Jewish and Christian culture, and also the notion of mingled identities, that is, a Jew who draws from the outside. We live in a world where we are not simply one-dimensional, but we have many loyalties, many interests, many perspectives in which we see life. And so, too, the Jews who I have studied. The last thing I want to say by way of this introduction is, for me, and here I put it even in Jewish terms, since this is a synagogue lecture, what I think an historian does is who mechayeh metim. He raises the dead from their being dead and gives them life by remembering them. Zochreinu lechayim, remember us to life. We are given life by reflecting on the past and by essentially redeeming these lives from oblivion and giving them a place within the pantheon of the past, and through that exploring our present. In other words, the historian is not a pure scientist. The historian chooses his topic or her topic because of his or her own present interests. And therefore, my role of a kind of redeemer of the dead or reviver of the dead, I'm not speaking I can be as God does, but nevertheless, it gives me a certain role in the larger cultural space of Jewish culture and Jewish civilization. All right, so now let me turn to this interesting character and give you a taste. And here I have lots of pictures to show you. So the title which I gave it, in addition to the title that you saw already, is a native of Poland professing the arts in London. You can all see this, correct? Everybody is seeing my screen at this point, right? Yeah.
Yes.
That is a line that comes from Solomon Bennett's own writing. As you will see in a second, he was born in Poland, or to be more precise, Belarus, which at that time had been taken over by the Russian Empire, but was certainly, when he was born, was still Poland. Made his way across the continent, and I will describe that in a second, and finally ends up in London, where he spends most of his adult life and becomes a professional engraver on the one hand, and also a writer and a student of Judaism, and particularly Bible and biblical translation. Here we have, so let me explore this by moving on. And my arrows don't work, Frank, but wait. Let me see if I can do it this way.
Right-hand key on your keyboard. Yeah, you go. Click on it.
Oh, now I can do it?
No, use your keyboard.
There you go. Goes. Okay, so here's a second picture, which is taken from a relative, which I still have not tracked down. Hubert Meredith died in 1961, and he had this hanging in his house. But you can see that Bennett has aged. He looks quite different. But clearly that was a second portrait that was done. By the way, the first portrait is a self-engraved portrait. While someone else drew the painting, he engraved the painting, and we'll talk about his engravings in just a second. Okay, now I have here So here's a timeline, and I want to run through this relatively quickly. I don't really care if you know all the details, but I want you to get the overall picture, the larger general portrait of this man. So this man is born in 1767 in a town called Polotsk in Belarus, which became White Russia, beginning with the partitions of Poland in 1772. He left and moved on to Copenhagen, where he became a student at the Royal Danish Academy of why is this cover? Wait, let me close this. Yeah, okay. Of painting, sculpture, and architecture in Copenhagen. Very unusual for a Jew to be studying in a place like that. Graduating in 1797. He soon left Copenhagen and came to Berlin, where he became a member of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts and Mechanical Sciences in Berlin, and is listed as a Kupferstecher, which is specifically a copper engraver. In 1799, he departs from Berlin for London, where he resides until his death. As you will see, he publishes a whole series of books. I'm not going to talk about each one of them right now, but just very, very quickly, his first book he publishes in English. Remember, this is an immigrant that comes from Poland. We assume he must have known some English beforehand. He certainly knew Polish, and he knew Russian, and he knew German quite well by this time. But here he publishes a work called The Constancy of Israel, which is both a history and a reflection on the contemporary Jewish experience in Poland. Later on, a work on sacrifices and also a polemic against Christianity, which we'll talk about. In 1817, he becomes extremely embroiled in a controversy with the chief rabbi of London, Solomon Herschel. He publishes a work in Hebrew called Tena Bikurim, and later on an English work where he puts all of the dirty laundry out in English for Christians to see, called The Synagogue of Duke Place. In these works, as you said, Bennett responds to one of the representatives of the rabbi and an attack which is initiated by the rabbi themselves. As you will see, he is very anti-clerical. He is very much against the notion of the rabbinate and rabbis. At one point in his memoir, he calls rabbis reptiles. I hope that's not too strong. And that's not why I was attracted to him, since I'm also a rabbi. But nevertheless, clearly his argument is standing as a Jewish intellectual, a Hebrew scholar who doesn't like the rabbi. And as you see, this appears several times as he tries to assume the prerogatives of a rabbi, even though he is only an artist. He gets married in 1818, as you see, has lots of children, and he is very poor. Publishes a work on the Molten Sea, which I'll explain in just a minute. Publishes what I think is his most impressive work, a commentary on the chapters in the book of Ezekiel on a rebuilt and reimagined temple during the Second Temple period with his own original plates, which I will show you in just a second. And then a little later on, let me just get rid of that black there so I can see it. Yes, he performs a wedding, which is very provocative, of a daughter of a convert, a Gioret, to a Jew, and writes an essay in which he justifies himself, is condemned by Rabbi Herschel and by Rabbi Meldola, the chief Sephardic rabbi of England, for officiating at what they consider to be an illicit union. So you see, he really pushes as far as he can the button on his prerogatives as a lay person. In 1829, he publishes a pamphlet against Hyman Horowitz, another interesting figure who came from Eastern Europe. We have all of these emigres who came to England at the end of the 19th century as they came to America in the 20th century and became Jewish intellectuals. Hyman Horowitz had just been appointed the first professor to hold a chair in Jewish studies at University College London. after he gave his inaugural speech, perhaps out of kinat sofrim, out of bitterness, Solomon Bennett published an essay against his understanding of the Bible, and he goes public and puts this into English, and therefore it has the temerity not only to attack rabbis, but to attack fellow intellectuals. In 1834, he begins a series of books, Critical Remarks on the Authorized Version, 1836, Specimen of a New Version of the Hebrew Bible, and then in between 1835, a treatise on the Hebrew language and its antiquity. The two previous texts are an attempt to say to his audience, I need to translate the entire Old Testament. Your King James Version, your standard edition, Protestant version, is filled with mistakes, and therefore you are losing your own practitioners because of a faulty translation. He begins to present specimens of this translation, but unfortunately he dies, although the manuscript seems to have been finished, and I'll talk about that in a second. In 1841, 3 years after he dies, a very interesting Christian by the name of Francis Barham, an intellectual in his own right, a universalist Christian, publishes his translation of the book of Genesis with the support of the family. So here we have, as you will see in a second, how Christians come to his aid in supporting his books and supporting his scholarship and create fundamental relationships with him, which were unheard of in other countries, to this extent, at least, in Europe during the same period. All right, so that's enough of details. Let me now show you some more pictures. This is, of course, where Polotsk is. These are the territories of Belarus. And this was originally Poland, as I said. You see it's right next to Vitebsk, where Chagall was born. So you get an idea of, and of course, near Minsk and Grodno, these were very important cultural centers for Jews. Polotsk is right up there, and you can take a look at it. But now to his work. I was fortunate to find about 30 engravings of, I'm not going to show them all to you, so don't worry, of Bennett. I don't know if you know very much about the history of engraving, but engraving, I think you might consider to be very much like the first mimeograph or the first copier. And essentially, the engraver takes a painting, and he pours ink over a copper plate or a wooden plate, and he copies over it and creates the same indentation of the painting itself, recreates the painting in an engraved fashion, and then this can be circulated en masse in a way that the painting cannot be. Engravers became very popular from the 18th century on. And clearly, this is the degree which Bennett had from Copenhagen. As a Jew, he was able to get in to a place which had a very small Jewish community, and there he survived as a student and became well known for his engraving art. Now, let me show you some of his engravings. This is none other than Frederick II, the King of Prussia. This won a prize and granted him membership in the Royal Academy in Berlin. And if we have Frederick, we also have his wife, Louise. And this is also Bennett's work as an engraver. Here is the head of the Berlin Academy of Arts, another fellow Pole, Daniel Chodowicki, a very well-known artist of his time. And we have many portraits of him, but this is the one that was done by Solomon Bennett. So you see, these have nothing to do with Jewish themes at all, at least not all of them. Here, of course, is that temple of Ezekiel I mentioned earlier. In this remarkable work, which appeared both first in English and then in Hebrew, and I'll talk about both in a second, there are two plates. This is the ground plan of the Temple of Ezekiel as Bennett conceived it. This is based, if you're interested in the text, on Ezekiel chapters 40 to 43, which provide a visual, a textual version of what the temple will look like, supposedly to be rebuilt by Zerubbabel after it was destroyed in 586, and it was rebuilt after the Persians allowed the Jews to return to Palestine. And clearly, Bennett thinks it is important for him and for his Christian readers and for his Jewish readers, and therefore not only creates this remarkable text, but also gives us images of this temple. So here is the first. Here is the bird's eye view. No, I went the wrong way, sorry. There is the bird's eye view of the temple. And you can see how he worked so hard. And what is interesting here is how he claims, he says, I know there are great Jewish commentators that wrote on this book. Who am I, a mere engraver? On the other hand, I have a sense of proportion. I have a mathematical sense. I have an architectural sense. I can understand the measurements that are going on here to make it possible to really explain the temple in a way that you cannot explain. And thus, he not only describes this process in great detail, but he visualizes it through his prints. Along those lines, I mentioned to you a work on the Molten Sea, Yam Shel Shlomo. What is the Molten Sea? The Molten Sea is what the Bible calls in 1 Kings chapter 7, a elaborate water system for irrigating the temple and providing it with showers and toilets. This is his own picture in the work, which he describes and interprets, and shows that Jews had a scientific ability to create a whole water system already in the biblical times, in Solomon's time. So therefore, what he does is to try to show that the ancient Hebrews indeed were gifted in all kinds of ways, particularly in this kind of scientific way. So this is his depiction of that particular moment in the history of the temple. And it is a very strange engraving at that. Here is another picture of the tabernacle based on Exodus 25, verse 9. This comes from a Christian book, and I will introduce Catherine Hausman of Bath in a second, where she brought up a whole series of his paintings. By the way, she was the donor who supported the book, his commentary on the book of Ezekiel, and he dedicates it to her, which I will show you in a second as well. But let me move quickly. These are really quite amazing because they have nothing to do with anything. He obviously did this for a living. Here's Napoleon. And are they good? Are they bad? Or is he a great engraver? Probably not. But nevertheless, he made a living from this. Here's George IV, one of the distinguished English kings. Here's William Shakespeare, painted by a 19th century, engraved by a 19th century Jew. Again, these pictures were very current, and I could identify even where this came from. And here is the Duke of York and Albany, a colored engraving, which is really quite amazing, from a horse and a rider and a soldier, done by an Eastern European Jew. Here is something much more controversial. This is a picture of the chief rabbi who hated Bennett, and who Bennett hated as well. But nevertheless, he took a painting of a man named Fraser, and he reproduced it without getting the proper permissions that were involved, even though he was engaged by the authorities to make this engraving. In the end, he was charged £100, and he didn't have it, and he was put in jail. So this is the famous painting of Herschel. Later on, Herschel took another one of his paintings and put it in a prayer book, an engraving, which we have a letter from Bennett accusing him of of a heresy. How could you put your own picture in a prayer book as if people are praying to you as the Pope, as a God in your own right? Now I come to very quickly, and I just want to give you an idea. What is interesting about this Jew is that he alienates himself from the Jewish establishment. He is clearly not an Orthodox Jew. Nevertheless, he still remains firmly attached to his Jewish heritage through language and literature and through his deep commitment to biblical studies. How does he make a living? Through selling his engravings, which ultimately lead to him becoming a Jewish scholar for the Christians. And what is remarkable is not the number of Christian people who are attracted to him, but the kinds of people who are attracted to him. So just quickly, all right, I'm going to show you two women. I have to have women in every lecture I give, but I usually don't have. But in this case, I have two really interesting ones. This woman is a very strange figure, an illegitimate daughter of a rich chancellor of the exchequer, as you see. She really became involved with suing her relatives, but of all things, she develops an interest in Hebrew and Kabbalah. This is such an extraordinary world that you would find this kind of woman. She engages several Jews in her Hebraic studies, including Bennett. Her archives are in London, and they are very extensive. And going through them page by page, I found several letters of Bennett to her and several letters that she wrote to Bennett. So we indeed have a relationship between this woman and Bennett. And let me just show you another picture of her. This is wild. When she was 18 years old, she was apparently caught by two young men who took her. One of them was married and was taken to their room and apparently raped her. And there was a trial, and she gained a great notoriety in London society. And that's the same woman that becomes essentially a woman who writes a very strange work on Kabbalah, hires Jews to help her, and engages with Jewish materials. So figure that one out. That is a very strange relationship. On the contrary, we have Mrs. Hausman, who I mentioned earlier. This is the dedication page of Bennett's Temple of Ezekiel, in which this is great for fundraising. Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba. You know the line, she is a tree of life for those. And he talks about the fact that those who fortify and support the tree of life, that is, of course, the donors that he's talking about. They're the ones that are celebrated by the psalmist. So therefore, he lauds her participation in this project and thanks her for being a wonderful donor. Mrs. Hausman wrote 6 works in her own right. She is a very strange woman because she is an evangelical who hated Newton and science and wrote 6 works arguing for a literal reading of the Bible and for denying the solar system and all of Newtonian physics and all of Newtonian science. They are really strange books. They are heavily illustrated. She compares ancient skepticism and ancient idolatry with the idolatry of present-day science. She was an extremely evangelical and Orthodox woman, and she loved Solomon Bennett. And she, throughout all of her books, she uses his engravings. Moreover, she even cites 2 of his books, including large passages from the Molten Sea, which he copies into one of her books. So here we have an evangelical woman. On the other hand, we have a woman who has, let's say, a very strange past, the previous woman I mentioned. But that's only a start. Take a look at this guy. Thomas Pettigrew was the librarian of the Duke of Sussex, one of the most major intellectual scholars in Europe. He was responsible for the Duke of Sussex, who had the largest collection of biblical manuscripts of books in the world, numbered in the many, many thousands. And he was the librarian, and he was also a very famous Egyptologist in his own right. What I found in London are 30 letters written on behalf of Solomon Bennett to the Literary Society of London. In each case, sponsored by a Christian donor, asking for money because this guy doesn't have enough money, that is Bennett, and he needs to support 9 children and a wife. Pettigrew was one of the people that supported him, invited him, showed him manuscripts in the library of the Duke of Sussex. And here, of course, he writes, Bennett is a profound Hebrew scholar, but his knowledge of the English language is too imperfect to render his literary powers of much relief to his family. Namely, he can't really sell books. By some criticisms upon interpretations of the rabbinic law, he has incurred the antagonism of the high priest. Of course, that's Rabbi Herschel. He's a seal of engraver, which was principally among those of his own persuasion, was completely destroyed and the poor man's resources cut off. I am satisfied he is a man of good, I believe, of exceptional character. We have several letters like this from Pettigrew, and Pettigrew has his own papers, which are at Yale University, which make him a very important intellectual figure as well. Here is William Friend, one of the major founders of Unitarian Christianity at the end of the 19th century. A close associate of Joseph Priestley. Friend writes again on behalf of Solomon Bennett, a very ingenious work entitled The Temple of Ezekiel, of which he has given in 2 plates the ground plan of the elevation. He is one of the most learned Jews in this country, but from a family and wife then of only 4 children, decreasing business and attachment to literature is at present in considerable distress. So Friend is the other spectrum. We have on the one hand an evangelical woman, and here we have a Unitarian, all right, who is extremely liberal. But we can even go farther than that. This is William Drummond. William Drummond was a biblical scholar who wrote to Bennett asking that he answer questions about the book of Daniel. This is an incredible line written by a Christian scholar who actually wrote an entire work in which he tried to interpret the Bible from an astrological point of view. In fact, Mrs. Hausman, who the evangelical lady I mentioned earlier, wrote a work against Drummond because she saw him as a Christian heretic. At the same time, Drummond is interested in Bennett and his work. Here is what he writes. I have to thank you for your answer to my remarks. I must do you the justice, however, to say that I think you defend the hagiographer, not only with ability, but with candor. I will fairly own to you that the latter part of the remarks is written chiefly with the view of knowing your sentiments on the subject. Perhaps you are not aware that we, Notzrim, he uses the Hebrew word Notzrim, means Christians. I dare not say plainer, seldom know the grounds on which you Hebrews rest your defense. See the article in the last monthly review, which is a very harsh review of Bennett's work, in which you are openly attacked. It is necessary and unavoidable for the fairest and most candid critic in our happy land of free opinion. And yet, to those who look below the surface, you are secretly praised and encouraged. So here is an extraordinary figure in the cultural life of England writing words of praise about Bennett. 1 or 2 more. Here is the Duke of Sussex himself, has very big legs, very well dressed, a leader of the Freemasons, a biblical and Hebraic scholar, a Judaic library, a correspondence, clearly loved by contemporary Jews, and clearly seen as their protector. Another liberal. Notice how we're going back and forth on the spectrum of political opinions of these Christians. Here is one more that is quite remarkable. Daniel Eaton was a radical thinker, and this puts us even beyond the liberals. Now we're on the radical fringe, who edited all of Thomas Paine's works. In the year 1812, writes Bennett, one Daniel Isaac Eaton published various tracts of Tom Paine, and he presented me with a copy of his writings. in which pamphlet, among the satirical allusions, I noticed that Paine greatly derided Scripture. Remember, Thomas Paine was one of the critical Enlightenment figures that really challenged the orthodoxy of Christianity at the beginning of the 19th century, charging it with foolish and blasphemous language. Bennett justifies his own decision. He uses this moment to retranslate the entire Old Testament into English to counter Paine's false misreading of the Bible, and thus to restore the Bible to its rightful place within the Christian world. So in other words, here is the service of a Jew. He's coming to serve the Christians by translating and by somehow responding to Thomas Paine's attacks. Very quickly, and we are done with this slideshow, here are the books that I've been speaking about. This was the first book, The Constancy of Israel. And I won't go through it, but there is 3 parts. The first 2 parts are polemics with contemporaneous works on Christianity, and the third is a history of the Jews. The work on the right is a work about the Holy Language, in which he argues that essentially the Hebrew that was laid out in the biblical text is a continuous language which has not developed or changed, but is still the authentic language of the Jewish people. Very strong attachment to language, which really defines Bennett's identity. Here is the Temple of Ezekiel work. The English is on the right. The Hebrew, which is only in manuscript, is on the left. And as you can see, it is called in Hebrew, I can hardly see it, but it says Torah Tabayit, the kind of which is a discussion in Hebrew. And what is really interesting is that they are not the same. The Hebrew version speaks about all kinds of Jewish allusions which Christians could not know, but it also in many ways justifies in a very deeper sense why he would be attached to this work and why it is important for Jews and Christians to understand the significance of the temple within contemporary Jewish culture and Christian culture. Here is the 2 works that are written against the chief rabbinate. The one in English is, I actually have the copy is from the Cecil Roth collection of Hebrew books and manuscripts in the University of Leeds in London, where it was donated. Cecil Roth was one of the great historians of Anglo Jewry. And he had this in his own library, which is really quite interesting. The text on the right, I won't go into the details, but clearly it was written by and published in London. You see London in the Hebrew, but it clearly was meant to be circulated among European Jews who read Hebrew. So in other words, he was bilingual and he wrote both in Hebrew and in English. And finally, these are my 2 latest finds. And I still have to explore these texts in greater depth. I discovered a 1824 Oxford Bible in 2 quarto volumes. I mean, there are enormous volumes. And these were the texts that Bennett owned, and he read through them and corrected them as a first preliminary step to writing his own translation. And what he did was to insert leaves of pages so that he could write a commentary and do his own translation on the side of the page. This text is 1,000 pages. I still have a lot of work to do. And I'm not sure how I'm going to approach this in enormous detail. But here you have from the book of Genesis, and in fact, the book of Genesis was published, his translation, separately, only the book of Genesis. But I have the entire Bible in 2 volumes, 2 quarto volumes, with his notes, and this is his handwriting, and these are his cross marks, and you can get an idea of what it is to find. And this, no one knew about it. It's not even in the catalog. It was originally in Jewish College, and now it is the property of some yeshiva in London, where I finally discovered it and got the librarian after a whole year to send me a copy, of course, for a charge. One more. Here is that version of the Hebrew Bible that was translated after Bennett died. by Francis Barham. Francis Barham was also a kind of Unitarian, but he believed in a religion where all religions shared one spirit of God, and he preached this religion and was an extremely unusual, radical kind of Christian living in Christian society. He was a major literary figure. He was the one that stepped forward after Bennett died to publish his translation. As you can see, the idea was to do the Holy Bible in its entirety, but only the book of Genesis was published 3 years after Bennett had died. So again, we have, and this was a bilingual edition. Heidenheim, of course, is the text in Hebrew on one side, and the other side is the English of Bennett. Unfortunately, I have not found the full translation yet, although I'm still looking, but I do have that interesting text which I just showed you. So that's really all the things I wanted to show you. And now I want to say something more general and try to give you a sense of why. I just want to get back to his picture, a sense of why I think this subject is worth doing. And what I want to do, it's now 8 o'clock. What time is it? 8:15? What time did I start?
Sorry, David.
What time did I start?
About 7:30.
Okay, so we're good. Okay, so I need about 15 more minutes, or maybe a little less. All right, so this is the text I just wrote, and I'm going to kind of read it and talk it, but it's only 3 or 4 pages, so don't feel you have to go to sleep on me. But I hope this will give you the essence and the larger picture. In other words, what I've done so far is introduce myself and my work. I've showed you I'm interested in marginal people, and I tried to bring them to life. And I hope you get an idea here with all of these wonderful pictures and this unconventional character that he is interesting, and that he plays a very interesting role between a Jewish and Christian world in the first half of the 19th century. As an immigrant from Poland who settles in London. Bennett's literary career begins as a polemicist with Christian exegesis or Christian misrepresentation of biblical texts. Then it shifts to a more direct study of biblical text, and finally to the bold aspiration of retranslating the entire Hebrew Bible into English. A literary career clearly motivated by his inability to continue as an engraver. I didn't mention this before because of eye problems. In other words, eventually he gave up his engraving by the second decade of the 19th century and devoted himself fully to his biblical studies. But his craft had initially led him into a Christian world of artists and literary people, and he enjoyed their financial and moral support at the same time. He was alienated from the chief rabbi and the Orthodox Jewish community, who saw him as a threat to their authority. And we've seen that already in his performing a wedding, in his asserting his authority over several decisions that were made by the rabbis and confronting them. The book is a study of what I will call a maskil. A maskil is the Hebrew word for a Jewish enlightener, a rebel against Jewish rabbinic norms and institutions, but a special kind of maskil shaped by an English environment where social intercourse with a non-Jewish world was made easier and more accessible in a relatively liberal and open cultural environment, with a keen interest among certain elites in biblical and Hebraic studies. One of my earlier books where this emerged, and actually Solomon Bennett appears in a few pages even in that book, is a work on the Jewish Enlightenment in England, where I argue for a whole group of thinkers who were influenced by Newton and Locke and were living out, and most of them, like Bennett, came from Eastern Europe. So we are speaking of, and including several Eastern European Jews who converted to Christianity. So that's also a subject of its own right. But here we have these emigres trying to seek out their fame and fortune by going west and by learning a new culture and a new language all at once. Bennett could not tolerate the arrogance and ignorance of the rabbinic establishment as he saw it, and acted defiantly against it, attempting to usurp its prerogatives and authority. Both for economic and social reasons, he felt the need to seek out and legitimate his expertise before a highly educated group of English literati who found him knowledgeable and useful for their own intellectual purposes. He entered into their circle and sought their support without radically assimilating or considering conversion. He was a proud Jew who had little interest in orthopraxis, that is, halacha, but held strong feelings about the literary integrity of Judaism, its spiritual mission, and its contribution to Western civilization. He was fascinated by Second Temple Judaism in particular, but for unique reasons, considered it a political and spiritual return to the original core of Abrahamic belief and a repudiation of the excesses of First Temple monarchy. He saw the ideal and most authentic Jewish polity to be similar to that of the English, a limited monarchy based on democratic principles, neither a monarchy nor a theocracy. His biblicism, his anti-monarchical views, and his emphasis on the spiritual essence of Judaism mark the very core of his proud Jewish identity. His abiding sense of the moral mission of Jews to the world, along with an appreciation of diasporic Jewish life, a preference to be a stranger in a foreign land rather than a ruler of one's own. That's a quote from his own writing. Marks his special kind of identity. His deepest commitment to Jewish civilization is language. For him, Hebrew, the divine language, never deviated from its primitive state. This provoked him to attack Hyman Horowitz in that famous inaugural speech that Horowitz gave as the first professor of Jewish studies at University College London. The gift of language communicates to posterity a universal history by some mode of writing rather than mere tradition. It is this linguistic connection which motivates him to write one of the most important works, that is the work on Hebrew language, defines his Jewish identity and the need to polemicize with uninformed Christians. It also leads him into a career as biblical critic and translator. For him, the capstone of his career is the creation of an authentic English translation of the Old Testament. Only a Jew is capable of doing this right, so he believed. And it is the holy task of the Jew to improve and perfect an imperfect Christianity based on a faulty transmission of the biblical foundations. This ultimately becomes his calling, one never fulfilled because of his death. Ironically, his contentious personality and his inability to abide by the norms of a Jewish community he could not respect and found oppressive served him better in the non-Jewish world. He was seen as suspicious in the eyes of fellow Jews who snubbed him as non-Orthodox, a deserter of his first wife and family in Belarus, in Belarus, and he not acknowledged, the opinion of the rabbis carries no weight for me, as he writes. Although he acknowledged he was an untitled layman, he usurped the authority of the rabbis in a contested case, even challenging the vaulted authority of a rabbi in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe called Akiva Eger, and other rabbis. He publicly ridiculed Professor Horowitz, as we said, and performed a wedding between a Kohen and a Georit against the wishes of both chief rabbis. His Christian friends, ironically, were not offended by his criticisms of their theological stances and their Hebrew learning. In a strange way, his outspokenness made him more attractive to them. Some of the most elite of the literary community respected his written work, supported its publication, and even recommended him for economic support during years of personal hardship, as we have mentioned. He speaks of them and their friendships with English gentlemen divested of religious and national prejudice. He is honored by these literary friends of the first rank. He certainly never thrived economically as a writer, but he did gain some notice and appreciation for his efforts. What, if anything, seems to unite some of these Christians, at least with each other and with Bennett? Seems to be a desire to revisit the scriptural foundations of Christianity with a view to challenging Trinitarian and ecclesiastical orthodoxy. This would be evident, for example, in William Friend, the Unitarian, and in Francis Foster Barham, remember, the publisher of Bennett's translation of Genesis, who was animated by a syncretic determination to put Christianity into a much bigger frame of universal revelation. The Duke of Sussex, that man with the enormous biblical library, a strong Whig liberal who was keen on the emancipation of Catholics and especially on greater rights for dissenters, and one assumes that the study of the scriptures was for him a solvent of religious difference. He was also an ardent Freemason. So was Pettigrew, the librarian, and a master of Egyptology, another Protestant libertarian, rather anti-clerical and removed from the Anglican Tories. With Drummond, we leave the world of dissenting scholarship for free thought altogether. In 1811, William Drummond, that was the one you recall who spoke about how Christians really secretly appreciated Bennett. Drummond published the Oedipus Judaicus, in which he attempted to prove the Old Testament was an extended astrological allegory. Paine's publisher, Daniel Eaton, fits here as well, along with the unique Rachel Fanny Antonio Lee. Remember that woman who has an affair and publishes a work on Kabbalah and does all kinds of radical and strange things. Bennett was also unique. On the other hand, there are high churchmen and Tories among his supporters. Catherine Houseman, the evangelical woman, Thomas Burgess, the Bishop of Salisbury, who I have not mentioned, Lord Ellenborough, both conservatives would have nothing to do with Drummond or Friend. Perhaps Bennett represents the figure of the Jewish scholar who can unify the fringes of the Christian world, where the Protestant impulse to seek the original meaning of the scriptures shades from orthodoxy to heterodoxy, a kind of attractive neutral sage who can cover over the fractures and tensions in that Christian community. Bennett was also unique, I'm getting very close to the end, in his ability to combine his artistic and scholarly interests, particularly in two works on the Molten Sea that we mentioned and the Temple of Ezekiel. He writes, I am connected with the arts, with literary subjects, and mankind in general. He even articulated an artistic and observational perspective. He uses in the Hebrew version of the book of his commentary on Ezekiel, the word hasagat tsiurit or habatat tsiurit, a kind of insight of perception, a kind of view of a perspective, of a picture. In other words, what an artist can see that an ordinary commentator could not see. This informs his exegesis of Kings and Ezekiel, which he claims gives him an edge over earlier Jewish and Christian exegetes. His profession as engraver and exegete do seem to come together in these two works. So here you have this remarkable fusion of his interest as an artist and his interest as a biblical commentator. Much of his biography still remains under a cloud, and he really leaves Belarus, and we don't know exactly why. How does a Jew from Belarus, who perhaps his parents were tavern owners, how could he develop an interest in art? How could he end up in Copenhagen? Where did this aspiration come from? And how could he also leave a family without any regret or guilt? He is accused by his enemies for leaving his first wife in Belarus, but he does not mention it. What happened to them after his departure? Who is the Elizabeth he marries in London? Apparently a Jewish woman, or perhaps a convert, but certainly a Jew, because all of his children have Jewish names and are members of synagogues. And how was it that he had 9 children, despite his poverty, most of whom became specialists in shorthand, which was apparently a very lucrative profession in the early 19th century, like engraving. His relationship with so many important figures can be demonstrated, but how deep was it in every case? They supported him in writing letters on his behalf, hired him as an engraver when he was still well. He writes them, regards them as good friends, but only rarely, as in the case of Drummond, do they directly respond to him. It is a highly limited social and intellectual encounter. We can't speak about buddies, sitting down and having beer together, although it's certainly possible. Perhaps a good English ale. But it suggests a relatively wider opening and a greater freedom of self-expression than for most other Jews. Compare some of the German Jewish intellectuals, like Moses Mendelssohn, for example. And although they encounter the non-Jewish world, they are clearly not as limited. They are much more limited than this very interesting, fluid openness on the part of Christian society to Jews like Bennett. Bennett's abrasive personality, his evolving ability to express himself in English and to become a translator, his self-confidence to challenge friend and foe alike, and his unique self-construction of Jewish identity all testify to the importance of his biography among Jewish thinkers of the modern era. At least they do to me. They keep me busy in my advancing age. And I hope if his life is not inspiring, at least I have demonstrated in one way or another why he is interesting to me and why it is worth reviving the dead, in this case, the name of Solomon Shlomo Yom Tov Bennett. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It seemed to me was exactly an hour, right? More or less.
Exactly. Very good. Yes. We're still open for questions. I think we have a little bit of time. I don't have any in the chat room yet, but I have a question of my own. It refers to your last slide. We're talking about Bennett's interpretation of errors in translation of the Hebrew Bible. This is the first time I, who's not a scholar of this, could see words crossed off and a different translation presented for it. I know there are plenty of these out there. And it's amazing how different the translation is that he's looking at and what he thinks it should be.
Yeah, I went too far.
Totally.
Yeah.
Too far?
Wait, I got it. No, there it is.
Not that one.
Wait, I got it. I don't know what happened to the picture, but I got the page. What happened to the picture? Why did I lose it? All right, I'm not gonna dwell on this if I can't find it. Wait, they're coming back, but for some reason I lost it. It's this page, but I don't have the slide anymore. I don't know where it went. In any case, so you're asking me, what are you asking me about that page? With all the crossing out and sense.
I was wondering whether or not you had a chance to see these things, or if people had written not just about misinterpretation and mistranslation, but how wildly far off it seems to be in some instances.
Yes, in fact, we also have there's been a lot of work done on the Bible in the 18th, 19th century. There's a very important book about the Bible in the Enlightenment period, which describes biblical criticism. Remember, this was the period in which Orthodoxy was confronted by a whole group of liberal interpreters. The beginning of biblical criticism. This was the age of Darwinism, which begins soon after, from 1860s on. So the Bible is, and biblical, literalness is now being challenged from all over the place. At this moment, also, Christians are feeling rather inadequate about their own biblical foundations. In a previous work, which I wrote called Connecting the Covenant, I essentially argued that a group of Jewish thinkers, and particularly the translation of the Mishnah, not the Bible, became important for Christians in trying to rediscover the world of Jesus, which they feel they were losing because of this new world of biblical criticism. So, and clearly the reference to Thomas Paine that I mentioned, of course, is another chapter in this history of assault against the biblical text and against translation. So clearly by this time, and I should mention to you also, at the end of the 18th century, and this is another book, my book on the Jewish Enlightenment, a man named Kennicott established an enormous fund, which he was supported by the British government, to collect all of the manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible all over the world and to collate a new version of the Bible and thus a new translation. He was trying to avoid the Masoretic text, which he claimed was a Jewish Bible, and he wanted to discover the real Christian Bible, which, of course, opened up the door to Jesus Christ. It was an enormous fallacy to do that, because he was looking at bad manuscripts. He was looking at, and by ignoring the Masoretic text, which had been preserved century after century by Jews, which was the most authentic text that we have in Hebrew, he was, of course, going off in the wrong direction. But nevertheless, in other words, there was a whole history of this kind of criticism going on. But let me say another thing about that Oxford Bible, which unfortunately I don't seem to be. Whoa. Right, it's coming back. Wait, so this is the, let me go back one. No, it's still not there. I don't know why. All right, forget about it. What I want to say is that essentially what Bennett is doing is not creating a new translation, but he's taking the latest critical version of the Christians and just correcting the errors that he saw of this. We have several Jews doing this. In other words, they weren't going to dislodge what was the Bible, the Holy Word in English, but they could amend it. They could improve upon it. So already 10 years earlier, he published several specimens where he showed how certain translations were wrong and how they were simply incorrect, and that essentially the Christian scholars that were commenting on the Bible, and he was quite familiar with all of the biblical commentaries of his time, were superficial in their Hebrew knowledge and needed really to deepen their understanding of Hebrew grammar. So what he did was, in order to prepare himself, and he describes this in great detail, he had the Hebrew Bible next to him, then he had the Oxford Bible with the English, and then he went through each of the English texts, compared it with the Hebrew, compared it with Jewish commentaries like Rashi and Ibn Ezra, the medieval commentaries, and then essentially crossed out, as you saw. And then on the left, he adds his own translation with his own commentary, because there was also to be a commentary that he wrote. And he shows you this already in the specimens that he put out earlier. So this was quite an elaborate text, but it was building on the Christian version. And some Christians liked it because they recognized that he wasn't abandoning their own text. He was simply improving upon it. So it's a very elaborate process. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this 1,000-page. I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm an historian of this period. So, can I really recognize, each one of his emendations and able to judge that over, 1,000 years of interpretation? But I probably will take some samples and try to show what he's trying to do. But the other extraordinary thing about this is that, he's a foreigner. He's criticized in his first book of 1809 for poor English. He said, it's a great book, some Christian writes, but you can't write in English. It's a shame. But he ends up towards the end of his life having the audacity to translate the great classic of English literature, the King James Bible. Again, I can't evaluate how good or how bad this is. I still have to study it more carefully, and and this is not known to biblical scholars, this text at all. But I'm going to try to find out a lot more and to evaluate the process. Clearly, he knew more about the Hebrew text than his Christian constituency, and of course, they appreciated him for that.
Oh, thank you. There's another question. Harold, perhaps you'd like to ask this one yourself. If you'd unmute, please.
Okay. Let's see if I can remember what I asked.
You wrote it in the chat room.
Yes. As I was listening, it was Bennett's aim apparently to reestablish Judaism as primacy relative to Christianity through a strategy using Masoretic Hebrew texts as evidence that Christianity was off track, sent off track because of poor translation. But this seems to me to be at odds with his iconoclastic attitude toward his contemporary rabbis in London, who presumably were more on track than the Christians. So am I missing something here? Is there sort of a disconnect?
Yeah, well, the one thing I haven't mentioned, which I guess I should mention, the rabbis were primarily interested in halakha, in Jewish law. They were interested in the Talmud. They were interested in the commentaries. They were interested in the codes. Notice that the choices that Bennett makes are biblical and not rabbinic. He's not uninformed by the biblical text, particularly the Mishnah, which is the first layer of the Talmud, right? That was written in the year 200 after the Common Era, after AD or CE. He quotes from the Mishnah because there is a chapter in the Mishnah which deals, for example, with the temple of Ezekiel. In Mishnah Midot, there is a whole discussion of the measurements of the temple, which are relevant for him to write his commentary. But he is not a rabbinic scholar. And therefore, it's not only that he appeals to Christians, he enters into their intellectual frame of reference by focusing primarily only on the biblical text. For him, a typical rabbinic scholar like Herschel, who wasn't a great scholar, he was a rabbi, was a practitioner. He got his job because his father had been rabbi in Berlin, and his father placed him in this outward community in London. He knew how to interpret Jewish law and to decide upon divorce and marriage and to bury people and funerals and so on. He was that kind of very efficient as a rabbi, rather than being scholarly and interested in biblical things. So the biblical part was really something that he seems to have developed on his own and really fit into Christian scholarship more than it fit into Jewish scholarship. It isn't that the Jews don't read the Bible and don't know biblical texts, but they usually know them through the Talmudic page. They know them through the intermediacy of rabbinic texts. And notice that this scholarship is primarily biblical. It is about language. He is a rational kind of scholar who is appealing, perhaps you could say cynically, because that's what the Christians are going to buy, as opposed to rabbinics. He knows rabbinics, but he's not a rabbinic scholar. And therefore, there is a separation between the interests of the rabbinate in keeping Jewish law and Jewish practice and studying rabbinic codes, and Bennett's interests, which are quite different. Does that answer you in part, at least?
Very helpful. Yes, thank you.
I think we can take one more. Is that all right?
As many as you want.
Okay, this one.
I just want to say, I hope I haven't lost the rest of you. I gave you an academic lecture. I didn't talk down to you. I didn't give you a version of what I called the synagogue. And I hope I didn't lose you, and I respected you by speaking on, I would give an academic lecture like this as well before an academic audience. But I was told you guys are all smart, so blame it on Moshe and Frank if the level was not right. But all I wanted you to see is what an historian does in terms of creating a subject out of nothing. Here is a life. Here's a story. And here is a whole world from Poland to London. And here is an interaction between Jews and Christians, and economic struggles and social interactions that are really are as interesting as your human relationships with other living people. I'm often accused of loving dead Jews more than living Jews. I would say I love them both. But what the idea here is to make this dead Jew become alive. And if I've succeeded, forget about all the details of my talk. If I've succeeded in any way in doing that, then I was successful. If not, blame it on Frank and Moshe. That's therefore for inviting me. All right, next question.
Excuse me. Sorry. Shoshana Silberman writes, I was reminded that Robert Alter, a professor of literature, creates a translation of the Bible that surpasses many of those done by rabbis. For example, in Etz Chaim. Perhaps the scholar is better suited to the task. What do you think?
Absolutely. And of course, if you go through, there is already there is a history of Bible translations going back in America to Isaac Leister, who lived in Philadelphia and did his own American translation of the Old Testament. But the most important before Alter and before was the old JPS, the Jewish Publication Society of America translation, and then their revised JPS translation, which followed, which became the standard translation until Alter, and there are several more, but of course Alter singularly did it himself. The JPS group were a group of scholars and rabbis. In other words, they combined the two together. But it was clearly very heavily populated by important scholars. And the one of the head of the editorial, the translation was a man named Harry Olinsky, who came originally from Maryland and was a Bible professor at the Hebrew Union College in New York. And he headed that Bible committee, which was made up of all kinds of other Bible scholars. So you're right, translation is a very difficult thing, and we can also trace the history of translations in many languages, done both by scholars and by clerical figures. In many cases, of course, especially in the pre-modern period, the same scholars are also clerics. In other words, those who go into biblical studies are generally clerics. Generally have degrees in divinity. So therefore, you can't say they're totally objective. But certainly the expertise of learning Hebrew and learning ancient Near Eastern languages. And also this group of people were the first to study Arabic, the Arabic as part of the Semitic languages. All of this came out of a cultural world which emerges in the late early modern period in the 16th, 17th century and reaches its height in the 18th and 19th century, and then creates an explosion of interest and friction over, what is the Bible and how do we preserve the stability of this biblical text, both for Christians and for Jews. But the fact that this Jew has stepped right into this world and claims that he's going to help out the Christians makes it extremely interesting. I guess we'll see the fate of Alter's translation. Will it be simply another academic translation, or will it move into? I've heard nothing but splendid praise for this remarkable work, and Alter is a brilliant writer who, any book that he writes is wonderful English. So we will see, but clearly Alter's, it's worth mentioning Alter in this regard. I don't think Bennett was as great a scholar as Alter, but they do have something in common here. They attempted to do what most other people could not do.
Yeah. As Harold points out, Alter had the advantage of 170 additional years of scholarship to call on as well.
True. But how much can you read, even for one person? I mean, usually this was done by committee. So that's the most remarkable thing. Like he could work alone and create all of these texts. We have individuals creating, translating the book of Isaiah or translating the book of Psalms. But to do the entire Tanakh, that's really quite a feat. And Robert Alter is not so young. I think he's over. He's in his 80s.
Okay, I haven't seen any additional questions. Let me say thank you to you, Professor Ruderman. Moshe, would you like to make some closing remarks here?
I sure would, Frank. On behalf of our audience and the Adult Education Committee, I thank you so much, David, for a marvelous presentation. I would also like to thank Frank Lees of our committee, who served as a Zoom master for this program. Not only does he manage our Zoom presentations, but he collaborates directly with our presenters before each program to iron out all the technical requirements and event timelines. Finally, I want to thank you, our community of adult learners, for being a wonderful audience. By the consistently high rates of participation, you have displayed an insatiable desire for high quality Jewish education. I would like to highlight two upcoming programs. The first, on the Jews from Arab lands, is on Sunday, January 30th, and the presenter, Sasha Golden Saba, will be coming to us from the Netherlands. On Sunday, February 6th, the Adult Education Committee is co-sponsoring a program in memory of Rabbi Bob Goldenberg being conducted by the National Chavurah Committee. Look for upcoming emails, weekly announcements, and on the TJC website for complete details. Good night.